Thanks for coming out on a rainy evening when I know you have lots else going on as well. Public bioethics, what is it? It's one way to think about it. It's the governance of science and medicine and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. And it turns out that public bioethics touches on some of the most important and difficult discussions of our age. How should we treat human beings before they're born? Are they human beings? How should we treat human beings at the end of their lives? Are they human beings? Should we manipulate the genetic stuff of humans before they're born to improve them? Improve them to what end? At what cost? Should we do whatever science enables us to do? Or are there limits with what we should do to other human beings or even to ourselves? To address questions like these is the very stuff of public bioethics, a field which involves a grounding in science and public policy. But it also requires a deep engagement with moral philosophy, for it's impossible to determine what's permissible to do to human beings without considering what it actually means to be a human being. What, to put it another way, makes human life worth living? Science, for all its merits, can let us know what can be done to human beings, but discussions of what it means to be a human being are necessarily moral and philosophical ones. We're lucky tonight to have one of the world's leading authorities in public bioethics here with us, someone equally at home in science and public philosophy and moral philosophy. Carter Snead is William P. and Hazel B. White Director of the Center for Ethics and Culture and Professor of Law at the University of Notre Dame, where he's taught since 2005. He did his law degree at Georgetown University after completing his undergraduate degree at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. After clerking for Judge Paul Kelly, Jr. of the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in the 10th Circuit, he served as the general counsel to the President's Council on Bioethics. And he's also served as the U.S. government's permanent observer to the Council of Europe's Steering Committee on Bioethics. And his research explores issues relating to neuroethics, enhancement, stem cell research, abortion, end-of-life decision-making. He's authored more than 40 journal articles, book chapters, and essays in all the leading law journals of the field. In case anyone doubts my own commitment to intellectual diversity, I, a committed LSU fan, have asked a most committed fan of the University of Alabama's football team to speak tonight. So I would hold that up in my merit. Professor Snead visits us tonight, though not as a guest of me, but of the George Washington Forum and American Ideas, Politics, and Institutions. The Washington Forum, unlike Alabama or LSU, doesn't receive federal funding, and it relies on private donations. I'm happy to say that tonight's talk is underwritten by generous donations of Ohio University alumni and staff, and by a grant from the Charles Koch Foundation. I want to thank them for helping us bring Carter to OU tonight, and I hope you'll join with me in welcoming him here.
Thank you so much, Robert, and thank all of you all for coming out. It is a dreary evening, and I appreciate you making the time and effort to come out here this evening. And this is my first trip to Athens, Ohio, and Ohio University. I'd heard great things about it, and it's very beautiful even in the rain. So thank you guys for coming. My talk this evening is entitled Being and Flourishing Toward a More Human Public Bioethics. Just to immediately jump to what the argument is that I'm making, is I'm going to make the argument that American public bioethics, and I'll elaborate on what that is a little bit, is grounded in an impoverished and hyper-individualistic vision of human identity and human flourishing that doesn't fit the more complex lived human realities. And what I mean by that is, insofar as we need to get the question right about what a person is and what constitutes human thriving, to have wise and humane and just governance in these vexed and difficult areas, we have to get that question right. We have to understand what a person is and what constitutes human flourishing. And my argument this evening is the dominant vision right now of what a human person is and what human flourishing is not right. In fact, it's partially right. There are some important truths about our identity and flourishing that underlies and anchors the American law and policy of bioethics. but it's also missing a very important element of who we are and what constitutes our flourishing and happiness. In particular, the law and policy in this area, I will argue this evening, can't provide a coherent account of human vulnerability, human dependence, human finitude, that is the limitations of embodied beings, which is what we are, or embodiment itself. The law and the vision of human personhood and human identity doesn't really give a coherent account of those questions, and it doesn't give a coherent account of our relationality to one another. It doesn't explain our obligations to each other. It can't make sense of the notion of unchosen obligations that we might have to one another, obligations in justice and love and mercy to other people that we have simply by virtue of our relationship to them, not because we've chosen that obligation, not because it's a contract or a transaction or even benefits us in some particular way. But we do have, and I think we think about, and what I'll ask you to do tonight when you listen to my argument, is to think about your own lived experience and to think about what you think, what is important to you and how you relate to other people, how you relate to your friends and your families and your members of your community and your fellow students and the people of Ohio and the people of the United States or people of the world. How do you think about your relationships to these folks? And I'm going to make some arguments about some special bonds and ties that we have to other people that we don't choose. But they're bonds of kinship, they're bonds of connection, they're bonds of community, and the vision of human identity that underwrites most of our law and policy of bioethics doesn't take account of that. And as a result, it makes it very difficult for the law to provide a coherent justification or even injunction or encouragement to honor those obligations to other people. And especially our obligations to vulnerable people, children, the elderly, and the disabled. These are people who depend on us, who require our help and our assistance. And the vision of human identity and human flourishing that underlies most of American law and policy, I don't think is sufficient and comprehensive enough to give a good account as to why we should help the vulnerable, children, the elderly, and the disabled. So making sense of our lived realities, and by extension crafting wise, just, and humane law and policy, requires an anthropological corrective to the foundations of American public bioethics. So the argument tonight that I'm going to make follows the following structure, okay? I'm going to start out, I'm going to tell you what public bioethics is in a nutshell. I'm not going to assume that you have any background knowledge at all of the topics that I'm going to be talking about this evening. You don't have to be a scientist, you don't have to be a philosopher, you don't have to be a lawyer to understand what I'm talking about. I'm going to try to make this as clear and accessible as I can. I'm going to describe in very plain terms, but given the prominence of public bioethics as a topic of conversation, a topic of debate, and so on, I think you're going to pretty easily access and relate to the subject matters that I'm going to be raising this evening. So I'm going to give a brief thumbnail sketch of what bioethics is, what public bioethics is, as distinguished from bioethics as a field of inquiry. Bioethics as a field of inquiry is an interdisciplinary field of study which involves evaluating the ethical questions that arise from advances in biomedical science and biotechnology in the clinical context of delivery of healthcare. It's an academic subject. You can take a bioethics class. You can get a master's in bioethics, maybe even a PhD in bioethics. That's not what I'm talking about tonight. What I'm talking about is the law and policy, that is the coercive power of the state, the law that we create together, given the form of government that we share in, that relates to this particular domain of human life. So public bioethics relates to law and policy. It's not just debate and scholarship and conversation. So I'll give you a thumbnail sketch of public bioethics, what it is, its substance, and also I'm going to talk about its human context, because it's the human context of bioethics, public bioethics, that I think illustrates the weaknesses of our vision of human identity and human flourishing that ground the law and policy that currently apply in our country. So, what is public bioethics? I'll lay it out. Secondly, I'm going to make an inductive anthropological analysis of the vital conflicts of public bioethics. That sounds complicated. All it means is I'm going to look at the different case studies, 3 different contexts of public bioethics, and I'm going to ask the question, looking at the law and the conversation and the theory that underlies it, what is the vision of the human being, human identity, and human flourishing that underwrites this whole program? It's inductive, meaning I'm not going to come to it with principles that I apply, but I'm going to look at the different cases, and we're going to tease out together what it is, the vision of human identity that underwrites this area of law and policy. And what it's going to show is that there is, at the foundation, at the core of American law and policy of bioethics, is a vision of human identity that I'm going to call atomized expressive individualism. Okay, and I'll unpack that. It sounds like a technical term of art. I'll unpack that also and explain to you precisely what I mean by that and why I think it is only a partial account. There are some aspects of it that are deeply true about what human beings are and what our happiness and flourishing consists. But it's incomplete in very significant and grave ways for public bioethics. So I'm going to tease out, we're going to look at these areas of the law, we're going to talk about what the law says in these particular contexts, we're going to talk about the theory that animates the law, and then we're going to ask the question, from this conversation, what is the picture of the person? What does the person look like that emerges from this conversation? And is that true to our own experience? Because that, at the end of the day, I'm not suggesting to you a canned or potted vision of human identity and human flourishing. I'm going to ask you to listen to the account that I believe underwrites American law and policy in this area. I'm going to talk about what I think the weaknesses are and the areas of our life, our shared life together, that it doesn't explain, and then ask you, and then it'll be your position and your job to think, well, does that make sense? Does the vision of human identity and flourishing that Professor Snead talked about, does that make sense in light of my own experience? And you're the one that's going to have to decide whether or not you find this persuasive. Okay, that's the process. And then finally, after critiquing expressive individualism as a theory of personhood that underwrites our American law and policy of bioethics, I'm going to offer a very brief and cursory anthropological corrective. I'm going to talk about the goods and practices and virtues that we need to bear in mind and think about and talk about when we craft law and policy of bioethics, the elements of the conversation that are missing, that are supplied by thinking about what it means to be a human being and what our relationships are to one another, such that we can ultimately craft, in a self-governing system like ours, a genuinely human public bioethics. Okay. And if you guys have a question in the middle of my talk, you can raise your hand and ask a question. If you need a call for clarification or something like that, this can be interactive if you guys want that. I'll try to keep my remarks relatively brief, and I actually meant to start a stopwatch, but I didn't do it, so I'm going to have to try to think. So if you guys start falling over, I'll say maybe I should wrap up, or if I hear snoring or whatever, that's cool if you have to sleep. But I'm just saying it'll be a good signal to me to slow it down or stop. So first of all, what is public bioethics? Professor Ingram gave a great definition. It's the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. It is the most obvious example of public bioethics is protections for human subjects of research. Okay, this is, in fact, in our country in the late 1960s, public bioethics in this country was born in reaction to several scandals. Scandals involving using vulnerable populations to conduct scientific experiments that were not obtained or that were not conducted with full informed consent. I grew up in Alabama. There's a place called Tuskegee, Alabama, which is very poor. And there were these group of very poor African-American farmers who the U.S. Public Health Service went into this impoverished part of Alabama and found men and women suffering from syphilis and did not treat them, did not tell them that they were there to study them in a passive way. The men and women of Tuskegee, Alabama believed that they were meeting with doctors that were there to help them. And then in the midst of this study, penicillin became a standard of care that was very helpful for people who had syphilis, antibiotics. And the researchers, the government-funded researchers, did not give it to these poor black farmers. They didn't give it to them on the grounds that they said, well, in the natural circumstances, the natural social and economic circumstances unfolding as it would, they wouldn't have access to it anyway. So we're not making their situation any worse. We're just studying them passively and letting the circumstances unfold as they would if we weren't even here. And it only took a very brief moment of reflection. It took decades, unfortunately, and it's a great shame to our country that this happened. But it took a very, on reflection, people came to their senses and said, this is an outrage. It's an outrage that these people, these poor people who are already the objects of discrimination, of poverty, and everything else, these people were being abused and exploited by scientists to do a natural history study of syphilis. So an apology was offered, but the question was studied by the U.S. Congress. And they said, this is an outrage. We have to make this right in some way, to the extent that that's possible now. And this is a great example of public bioethics. If all we cared about was scientific progress, if all we cared about was the pursuit of knowledge, full stop, and nothing else, we wouldn't have guidelines and protections for human subjects in research. We would kidnap people, we would take people and use them, and we would basically say, you know, we're doing this for the greater good, the development of knowledge. But we don't. We stop ourselves. We slow down the progress of science by having human subjects protections, because we care more about human dignity and human autonomy and the integrity of the human person than we do about the raw pursuit of scientific knowledge, as important and valuable as that is. Okay? So that is the governance of science and medicine and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods. The ethical good being autonomy and beneficence and the dignity and integrity of these poor people in the example of the Tuskegee scandal. Right? So we always restrict science in the name of ethical goods. We do it in the ethical good of honesty. We require people in transparency. There are many, many ethical goods that we impose as a restraint on the pursuit of knowledge. Okay, so because one natural intuition might be, well, ethics has no place in the governance of science. But if you think about it for a minute, you realize, no, of course that's not right, because when human beings are involved, you have to be respectful of their freedom and their privacy and their dignity and the rest. So protections for human subjects of research is the sort of founding question that arose that gave birth to American public bioethics, but there are many, many other questions involved. Embryo research, fetal research, research involving assisted reproduction, the use of assisted reproduction like IVF, human cloning, abortion, genetic screening, gene transfer research, synthetic biology, research involving hybrids and chimeras, that is, admixtures of human and non-human species, conscience protections for healthcare providers, end-of-life decision-making, the definition of death, physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia, cognitive neuroscience and its use in criminal law, criminal sentencing, property in the body, surrogacy, selling organs, and the like. It's a lot to take in. And the things that you'll notice about public bioethics as an area of law and policy is that, first of all, it's unbelievably complicated, right? Not only do you have to understand the underlying science and technology to formulate a well-informed decision about what you think about these things, they also involve technologies and practices and interventions that seamlessly integrate great goods and grave risks. What's an example? You probably have read about genome editing. CRISPR genome editing is a highly precise and getting more reliable all the time way of actually editing gene sequences in the genome of a living organism. You can get in and change the genome, and that could be a great thing if a person has a heritable disease, a disease that is devastating that they will pass on to their children. You can get in and you can fix their genome, eliminate the problem, and then they would pass on the fixed genome to their subsequent offspring. It's called germline modification. Sounds great. Seems like a great therapeutic intervention, but what about the possibility of creating a genetic change that is harmful by accident that would be heritable and passed down through multiple generations of the same species? It could be devastating to entire species, entire populations. There's the use of a technology called a gene drive, which has been proposed to use to eliminate entire species, nuisance species, mosquitoes with malaria, for example. Introduce a genetic change that makes that induces sterility or induces some kind of suicide gene, right? And it gets passed through a population, and it progresses at a dramatic rate, and you can eliminate entire species. That's the theory, right? That sounds like on its face, you could say, okay, that sounds kind of good. Eliminate malaria as the leading cause of death, and different parts of the world. It'd be great to eliminate the mosquitoes that carry malaria. But then the question becomes, what are you doing? I mean, first of all, what if there's a biosecurity accident, right? And what could possibly go wrong if you're genetically engineering mosquitoes and they get out of the enclosure and breed in some other way, and there's some subsequent result that passes through the species like wildfire? That's a potential very serious concern. So you see the admixture of goods and harms and risks combined in the same technology. The technology is neutral, right? You can put it to great uses and you can put it to harmful uses. And that's one of the things that makes this uniquely complicated. It's also uniquely contested because we're dealing with questions about when life begins, what we owe to each other, what constitutes death, what is our relationship to our bodies? Do we own our bodies? Could we sell our bodies? Could we sell our body parts? Do we own our bodies so that we should be able to commit suicide? Should we euthanize people whose quality of life we judge no longer to be worth living? These are hard questions. These are questions that go to the deepest matters, normative matters, self-understanding, our relation to one another, and therefore people have strong and sometimes bitter disagreements about them. So it makes this area of the law quite difficult. And then finally, what we'll notice about this area of law is it involves what I'm calling vital conflicts. The stakes could not be higher. We're not just talking about what we owe to our neighbor, but we're talking about who is our neighbor. What are the boundaries of the moral and legal community? Who counts as a person and who is a non-person? Who gets human rights and the protection of the law? And who can be used and destroyed and instrumentalized for the sake of a scientific experiment? These are deep questions about life and death and health and wholeness, freedom and justice and equality, and the boundaries of the moral and legal community. So public bioethics is a hard and vexed and much disputed area of the law, and the stakes could not be higher. Other than that, it's easy, though. Yeah, yes?
Will you develop later about this, who is not the person?
Yes, that's a major part of what I'll be talking about. Yeah, thank you for the question. The question is will I be grappling with the question of the boundaries of the moral and legal community? Who's a person? Whose good counts as part of the common good? Yes, absolutely, I will. So one final thing to say about public bioethics, and this is important and essential to my argument, which is the human context of public bioethics is illness, is weakness, is suffering, is vulnerability, is dependence, is finitude, facing our death as organic beings who don't live forever, and most fundamentally, embodiment. What it means to be an organism, what it means to be a thing that lives and experiences the world and experiences others in bodies. So, that's public bioethics. All right? Let's proceed then to what I called the inductive anthropological analysis of American law and policy in this area. Meaning, put it even more simply, let's talk about what the vision of the person is and what human flourishing is that grounds and animates the law and policy in this area. But let me say a brief word as to why I think this is a fruitful way to analyze the law. And I teach my students this at Notre Dame. The richest and deepest way to understand a law, any law, it could be a regulation in any context. It could be a tax law, it could be a environmental law, could be a criminal law. The deepest and richest way to understand what the law is and means and how it works is to analyze what the law is for, to drill down to its deepest foundational purposes. Okay? Now, a couple things to realize about law. Sometimes, and again, this is intuitively attractive in some ways, say, well, law and morality, those are separate things. We shouldn't legislate morality. Those are different statements, by the way, right? What we should and shouldn't legislate is a question we should have a conversation about. Not every wrong should be forbidden, and not every good should be, subsidized and funded and encouraged, right? There's space for private ordering, and that's clear. But every law on the books and every conversation about law ultimately aims at a particular good to be pursued or a particular harm to be avoided. So law is inextricably and unavoidably normative. Law is always about good and bad. And in that way, justice and injustice. Law, and therefore law is always and irreducibly moral, depending on how you define moral. If you define moral versus ethical, there's a lot of different disputes about how to define those terms. But what I'm talking about is a question of value, good, bad, indifferent. And the deepest way to understand the law is as a reflection of a purpose, a normative purpose by whatever the lawmaking body is, the legislature, the executive branch, the judiciary, the administrative agency, whatever. The purpose is to achieve some end. And you need to know what those ends are to understand the law. First of all, to decide in the first order question is that a good end? Should we be doing this with the law? A law that bans interracial marriage, that's a bad law. Why is it a bad law? Not because it doesn't work or it's inefficient, it's because the purpose of the law is bad and unjust and inegalitarian, right? So you drill down to the purpose of the law and you analyze that, and then you'll have a great understanding. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a very flawed person and judge and not someone I normally quote in bioethics talks for reasons that we can get into later, did say something deeply true about many things that were deeply true about the law. He said, law is the witness and external deposit of our moral life, meaning you can look at the law and work backwards and draw really good inferences about what a particular society cares about, what harms are they trying to avoid, what goods are they trying to pursue, by looking at the law. So you understand what the law is in terms of its purposes. That's the richest way to do it, because you can say, are those good purposes? And if you say, yeah, they're good purposes, or they're fine, whatever, then you can ask questions about the fit between the mechanism of the law, the means of the law, and the ends. You say, well, it's a good purpose, but the law doesn't work because it doesn't achieve what it's trying to achieve. You see, that's the best way to understand law in the richest sense. But law doesn't just reflect the goods of a given society. Law also informs and teaches the members of a society what they should care about. So law is, for better or worse, deeply pedagogical. People look at what's legal and illegal and draw inferences about what they should and shouldn't do, not just in terms of obeying the law, but also about the worthiness of those things themselves. If something is criminalized, most people draw the inference that, well, it's probably a bad thing to do, morally speaking, probably unjust. Shouldn't kill people. It's bad to kill people. That's why homicide is illegal, right? Shouldn't steal, and so on. So law teaches us, Louis Brandeis said, law is the omnipresent teacher. So understanding the law in terms of its normative core is essential for understanding the law and reasoning about it. Now, why an anthropological analysis? Why do I keep coming back to that notion? I'm just using the word anthropology not in its academic sense, not in the sense of as an academic discipline. I mean in the sense of the question of what a person is. What is a person, and what constitutes a person's flourishing? That's what I mean by an anthropological question, okay? Law is fundamentally about and for the protection and flourishing of persons. Law exists to help persons, individually, collectively, to mediate our relationships to one another, to mediate our relationships to associations of other people, to government entities, other nations. Law exists to order our relationships, to protect us, and ultimately to promote our flourishing. It unavoidably, therefore, rests upon a mostly undeclared and unarticulated conception of what human identity is. So if law is for persons, and that's a pretty uncontroversial proposition, every law has to presuppose what a person is. You have to know what a person is and what's good for people and bad for people in order to have a good, wise, and humane law. So, the deepest way to understand law is to drill down, I will argue, to its anthropological core and ask a question about what vision of human identity and flourishing is driving and grounding the law at issue, okay? Who and what does the law assume persons to be? That's the question I'm asking. And I'm asking it in the context of public bioethics, which is complicated, contested, stakes are high, and occurs in a human context characterized by vulnerability, suffering, dependence, and embodiment, and finitude. So we have what I'm going to call contending anthropologies. That is, there are different visions of human identity, human flourishing at work. What's the vision that underwrites the law? And I'm going to talk about one particular vision. I'm going to call it expressive individualism. It's not a perfect taxonomy, but it comes close to what I mean. Robert Bellah, who's a very famous sociologist, wrote a book called Habits of the Heart, identified a strand of orientation or a vision of human identity, human flourishing that troubled him in his sociological evaluation of Americans. Charles Taylor, a philosopher from McGill University in Montreal, took this sort of type of human identity and studied it deeply and drew out some difficulties with it. And I'm going to be relying in part, and so did Alistair McIntyre. Alistair McIntyre is a great philosopher. Office is next to mine at Notre Dame, wonderful older gentleman, and others. These guys were, and Michael Sandel, a political theorist at Harvard University. Sometimes these people are referred to, and I think it's an inadequate moniker, as communitarians. They're people who take seriously our relations to one another. People take seriously our relationships and obligations of solidarity and community and the like. And they looked at what Robert Bellah had identified empirically and did a philosophical critique and analysis. And I'm going to be relying in part on some of their work this evening and applying it in the public bioethics context, which has not been done in the past. But if you are familiar with those thinkers, you'll recognize their insights here. What is expressive individualism? It conceives of a person. What is a person? The answer it gives is a person is fundamentally an isolated, atomized individual. The fundamental unit of personhood is the individual. We should understand people in the most deepest way as individuals, okay? And they're individuals who are separate and apart and distinct, best understood as separate and apart and distinct from the communities in which they live, from the families from which they come up, from other relationships that they have. They are individuals, isolated and atomized. Persons are defined primarily by their, and this is the expressive piece, by their will, by their desires, by their minds. Okay, so this vision of human identity is, to use a philosophical term, dualistic. It separates the mind and the body, separates those two things, and prioritizes cognition and will and judgment as the fundamental defining characteristic of a person. A person is an individual who can formulate future-directed plans or projects and pursue those projects. Those projects come from inside. Those projects come from the individual's own sort of endogenously created desires. Michael Sandel calls this a self-originating source of valid claims. Okay, you are the source of your projects and desires. It's your originality and your individuality that gives rise to these projects. Your mind is the tool that you use to pursue them. Your body is instrumental. Your body is not essential to what you are. Your body is a tool to pursue the goods that you yourself determine, invent, create, and identify. Persons are defined by their choices. They are defined as individual choosers or consumers. A person is defined by, and this makes sense, right? If what a person is an isolated will that internally generates projects to pursue, that what defines a person and makes them important is the choices they make, the projects that they choose, and their capacity to choose. That's constitutive of what the person is. And as I said, human flourishing is the pursuit of those projects of your own construction. This vision of human identity is, to use another philosophical term, anti-teleological, meaning that it doesn't regard nature itself as providing purposes or ends to be pursued. There's nothing, nature is, again, instrumental. It's stuff that's outside the individual that can be harnessed and used and brought to bear in the pursuit of his or her projects, okay? There's nothing normative about nature. There's nothing normative about our bodies. There's nothing normative about anything that we encounter in the physical world. It's all just inchoate stuff that can be harnessed and manipulated and used in pursuit of our own projects. Anti-teleological. This vision of human identity that Bellah identified and Taylor and others have explored understands human relationships as primarily instrumental and transactional. Okay? Individuals can encounter one another. They encounter one another as individual wills. And sometimes they can collaborate when there's a shared interest and they can come together and collaborate. But oftentimes, individual wills encounter each other as adversaries. They encounter each other in a way that, that they have to overcome the other in order to realize their goods, their projects. And the only obligations that are binding, on us morally are those that we choose. Again, back to the notion of choice, back to the notion of rational decision-making, the rational chooser, as constitutive and definitive of what we are. So there's no such thing in this understanding of the human individual as an unchosen obligation. No one has a claim on me, nor do I have a claim on anyone else, morally or otherwise, for assistance or care or support that we didn't agree to. Okay? And it follows from this vision of human identity and flourishing. And some people, and Carl Schneider, who's a law professor and bioethicist at the University of Michigan, he said that this is a vision that sometimes individuals encounter each other as adversaries clad in the armor of their rights. Okay? So rights talk, Marianne Glendon, law professor at Harvard, former ambassador to the Holy See, member of the President's Council on Bioethics, wrote a book called Rights Talk, and talks about how describing the world in terms of individual rights, as important as they are, can create an adversarial dynamic, can create a system, an adversarial and antagonistic framework where we think about ourselves and think about what separates us and what we compete over, as opposed to what binds us together and what connects us. Okay? Now, this vision of human identity, which I'm calling expressive individualism, has a limited vision of ethical goods, right? You can guess by now what the most important ethical good is. It's autonomy. Autonomy and self-determination is the highest good to which all other normative goods are subordinated. Injustice is framed as the constraint on the freedom to pursue projects of one's own choosing. Government and social life, government in particular, the role of government is to remove constraints, public constraints, private constraints, even natural constraints, perhaps, and otherwise provide the conditions for what Michael Sandel has called the assertion of the unencumbered individual self. Now, Charles Taylor, Alistair McIntyre, many others, Robert Bellah, have said that this vision of human identity, it captures some important truths about who we are. We are individuals in an important sense. Freedom and privacy are important things. Freedom and to engage in transactions with other people is important and has its place in human experience. But that's not all there is. It's not all there is. And what this account of the individual life lacks is some of the important details of our lived experience that I think you'll recognize in this enumerated list. Human beings are profoundly vulnerable and dependent upon others. We come into the world as maybe one of the most vulnerable newborn organisms of any species. Our babies, human babies, are more dependent on their parents than almost any other species of babies. It's due in part because the size of the brain development, the skull grows, the brain grows. The baby has to be born before the head size becomes of such a size that it would not be possible to pass through the birth canal. So there's an interesting evolutionary reason for that. But we are profoundly vulnerable. And Alistair McIntyre, my colleague and friend, wrote a beautiful book called Rational Dependent Animals, in which he goes through and analyzes and expresses in a very compelling way the notion of human vulnerability and dependence. I mean, think about your own experience in your own life. You were dependent on others when you were a baby. You're dependent on others even now for a whole variety of things, on the beneficence of others, on the sacrifice of others. You will be dependent on others the older you get. If you ever get really sick, or if you've been really sick or injured, you've been very dependent on other people. It's part of the human condition. And Alastair talks about a scale of disability on which we all find ourselves. There is no self-supporting, self-sustaining individual human being in the human species. You have to work with other people. You have to depend on other people. So vulnerability and dependence are essential elements and features of the human experience. Okay? And that's true in spades in the context of public bioethics, which deals with illness, injury, vulnerable subjects, the use of human beings in experimentation, and the like. Second thing that this vision that Bella identified is missing is the notion of embodiment. We exist in the world as bodies. You don't encounter a person, in our experience, who is not embodied. We encounter one another as bodies. We encounter the world as bodies. And as a result, that should have, we should think about that at least, when we're imagining who we are and what constitutes our flourishing. Because our body, and if you've ever been sick, you know that your embodiment affects your flourishing. That's part of what it means to be an embodied organism. Human beings, because of their vulnerability and dependence and embodiment, are situated in relation to other people. We are in families and communities and nations who make our flourishing possible. And as a result, we're indebted to those people. And sometimes we can't pay those people back, so we have to pay other people back. We have to care for other people. Alistair calls this just generosity, because you're the beneficiary of this sacrificial care and love and support. It's fitting that you return the same. Even the idea of expression, like expressive individualism, rests on an idea that your self-identity is a function and is created by expressing who you are, generating and expressing who you are, and showing who you are. Well, even the notion of expression implies relationality, right? It's what Charles Taylor calls the dialogical nature of the human condition. Our identity is defined in conversation with other people. It doesn't mean they define who we are, and in fact, resisting other people's visions of who we are is sometimes an important element of defining ourselves, but it's done in relation to others. And Michael Sandel makes the point that self-definition, if we are unencumbered selves, if we can't have constitutive attachments, if everything has to be on board already in terms of who we are and why we're valuable, then we have a hard ceiling on how much we can actually express who we are and define ourselves. Because again, constitutive connections to others, to communities, to families, who you are is in part a function of where you come from. So even defining yourself requires relationships. So what are the goods, virtues, and practices for relational, embodied, vulnerable, reciprocally dependent beings? I will argue we need to craft a public bioethics that at least takes seriously and thinks about and talk about as we govern ourselves certain goods that are missing from the dominant picture. And what are these goods and practices and virtues? Gratitude, being grateful for the support and love and affection and sustainment of others that was essential and is and will be essential to our life and flourishing. Humility, the idea that we should be humble in the face of creation, in the face of other people and the goods that they care about, and our own limitations. We should practice what William May, who's a Protestant theologian, who was on the President's Council, later Michael Sandel embraces, practice openness to the unbidden. That is, as you all know, life has all kinds of unexpected developments, good, bad, and otherwise. And we should be, by virtue of our embodiment, our vulnerability, our dependence, our relationality, things happen. And the best response in many cases is to begin, at least, with a kind of openness to the unbidden in certain kinds of contexts. We should practice what Alistair McIntyre calls the virtue of acknowledged dependence. We shouldn't kid ourselves about our own self-reliance. We depend on others. We should acknowledge that. Related to that is the good of solidarity. We should understand, by virtue of our relations, of our past relations, of our future relations, all of the connections that we have, that we do owe a kind of obligation to care for and think about and share in and accompany others in the sorts of sufferings and difficulties that they have, especially that I'll be talking about a little bit in the bioethical thing. There's a good called misericordia, and sometimes it's translated as pity. I don't think that's a good translation. It's more about it's closer to something like empathy, accompaniment, taking someone else's suffering on as your own, It's almost a kind of friendship, right? And that brings me to the last idea, is that friendship is absolutely essential as a good that we should think about and draw upon in formulating the law and policy in this particular area. Okay, so that's kind of a longish introduction to the anthropological model that I believe underlies the laws and the one and the corrective that's in order. So let's talk a little bit about the law, right? So in the 1960s and 70s, public bioethics was born in the United States. Okay, I mentioned Tuskegee scandal. There were other scandals involving abuses of vulnerable research subjects, disabled children, elderly people, people with dementia injected with terrible diseases and so forth to study the progress of those diseases, written up by a physician named Henry Beecher. And there were also reported instances of research on unborn children who were slated for abortion that prolonged their death and constituted what a lot of people thought on all points on the abortion question, pro and con, thought was a kind of abusive and extractive way to treat a human being, even if he or she is slated to be aborted. So in the 1960s and 70s, there was a confluence of scientific, legal, political, and cultural developments which raised serious challenges to the categories that we used in thinking about essential features of human life. Challenges to the nature and meaning of human procreation and parenthood. Challenges to our understandings of the obligations of parents to their children, or even what it means to be a parent. Challenges to prior understandings of the identity, worth, and definitional boundaries of human persons. And finally, the challenges to prior conceptions about the ends and means of scientific inquiry in medicine. What am I talking about? 1968, Steptoe and Johnson in the United Kingdom achieved, for the first time in human history, the conception of a human being, conception of a human organism, living human embryo, outside of the body, in a dish, in vitro. Literally in vitro. In vitro means in glass. In vitro fertilization. It was the first time on the history of the planet that we were able to observe externally the process in which a human organism comes to be through fertilization, through the union of egg and sperm, giving rise to a new distinct living member of the species, Homo sapiens, right? And this human organism in a dish was studied, first of all, for the purpose of treating infertility. Well, both for study of biological development, but also for the treatment of infertility. And in 1978, Louise Brown, a little baby in the United Kingdom, was born. The first, they called her a test tube baby, was born by this technique. She was conceived outside the body, and then she was transferred into her mother's uterus, where she attached to the uterine lining and continued to develop, as all babies do, through 9 months of gestation, and then was born. It was a world historical moment. Again, pregnancy is very mysterious. When it occurs inside the body, conception occurs, that is the creation of a new life, occurs before we have any technology to detect its existence until it begins the process of implanting in his or her mother's uterine lining. That's the point at which we have technology, pregnancy tests and the like, where there are hormonal changes and so on, blood tests, that we can measure changes in the body that indicate the presence of a new human life emerging in the womb of his or her mother. 2 weeks prior to that moment of implantation, you have a living organism in the fallopian tube moving down the fallopian tube towards the endometrial layer to implant, right? So to have the human organism outside the body is an extraordinary paradigm shift in our understanding of human development and what it means to be a human being, right? And then Louise Brown was born, and that brought even to sharper relief what it is we did and what we're talking about. Edwards and Steptoe, talked about Louise Brown when she was in the Petri dish. They said, we saw her when she was conceived, and she was beautiful then. They see her when she was born, and she's beautiful now. And that captures a biological truth about the continuity of life, right? That every person in this room began life as a human embryo and went through all the stages of development that are species-specific to Homo sapiens. The continuity of biological development is one of the arguments, or one of the facts that's pointed to by those who would argue that it's an injustice to intentionally kill a human being at that stage of development without serious justification. And it's a fact that's well understood and embraced in the context of embryology. The dispute about abortion and embryo research and so on, we'll talk about these things momentarily, is not about when life begins as a biological matter. It's about what is owed to the human organism at the various stages of development. Do you believe or do you affirm that justice requires minimal protections of the law at every stages of development? Or are there moments in the human developmental process where after which you're entitled to the basic protection of the law, before which you're not, and why? That's, in a nutshell, the argument about the sort of pro-life, pro-choice, or pro-embryo research, anti-embryo research argument, right? But with the capacity to create a new human being outside of the body in vitro, it opened the door to an amazing array of possibilities, for the procreation. The idea of people being able to bear children who otherwise wouldn't have been able to. But it also created new possibilities to manipulate and instrumentalize human life. In the context of IVF, it allowed for the possibility of genetic selection. That is, you could analyze the embryos prior to transferring them to the mother's body, right? And what are you looking for? Well, you could look and see if there's some genetic disease that you're worried about. And generally speaking, when these tests are applied, the embryos that fail those tests are discarded and destroyed. That is, the living human organism's life is ended as a result because they failed to meet a standard that was established externally by some others. But most commonly, genetic selection is used for sex selection. It's used in the IVF context to what's sometimes referred to as family balancing, where the embryos, and most often, empirically, the little boy embryos are transferred and the little girl embryos aren't. Okay? It's IVF that created the possibility of this kind of discrimination between male and female embryos, human beings at the embryonic stage of development. And so that, again, is something that we have to grapple with. It opened the possibility of human cloning, of creating an organism that is virtually genetically identical to a pre-existing organism, which raises all sorts of questions about human identity, the relationship among the generations, freedom, exploitation, and the like. There are advertised what one could, I think, fairly call eugenic applications of this genetic screening of embryos, right? Non-medical traits that you prefer: height, eye color, IQ. Now, a lot of these things are overhyped. Most of these things are not single-gene phenomena. Most of them aren't even purely genetic phenomena. But I can guarantee you there's a market for it, and I guarantee you that people will pay lots of money to take interventions to discard and destroy embryos that don't meet those standards, or even get abortions when the unborn child being carried fails to meet some preferred standard. Sex is the most obvious, but others also. We have very significant incidents of the elimination of unborn children who have been diagnosed with Down syndrome, and this raises serious concerns about disability and intolerance of imperfection. And how do we think about those children? How do we think about people that we encounter on a daily basis when there is a pattern and project of eliminating that kind of person? Iceland is celebrating the fact that it has a 100% elimination rate of unborn children with Down syndrome. There's a big event at the UN recently where people with Down syndrome testified and said, "We don't like this. This is upsetting. This feels like a violation to us. This feels like you are trying to eliminate the very kind of person that we are. You don't appreciate what we are. You don't. It's not about health. It's not about our health. It's about our burdensomeness to you." Putting that to the side for a moment, we also have the possibility with IVF and related technologies to fracture into its component parts the procreative process, which previously was pretty unified. You can have different people who donate the gametes, the egg and sperm, different people who to carry the baby, different people to rear the baby. In fact, there are some interventions where you can have 3 genetic parents. You can have a mitochondrial donor, mitochondrial DNA from the cytoplasm of the egg, as well as nuclear DNA from two separate women, and then the DNA from a man, right? So with the fracturing of what was previously unified, you have all kinds of difficult ethical questions and legal and policy questions to contend with. And surrogacy is one of these, is an additional issue that arises here. You may have read about this case. There was a couple, I think they were from Australia. They went to I might have been Thailand or somewhere, the Philippines, and they found a surrogate. And it won't surprise you to learn that many of these surrogates are poor people who the only thing they have to sell are their wombs or rent their wombs. And so there's a serious question about exploitation and abuse of the poor. But be that as it may, this situation, this rich couple found this poor woman in the Philippines, and they said, we want you to be carry this baby to term. They went through the IVF process. The surrogate became pregnant. Baby had Down syndrome. The couple said, we're not paying you, and we want you to abort the baby. It imposed a kind of consumeristic, almost quality assurance set of categories on a human context, the context in which human beings come to be, right? Raises question about what parents are, about obligations to children, about what children are. The surrogate said, no, I'm not getting an abortion. She gave birth to the beautiful baby, and she's raising the baby herself with the assistance of some social service agencies. So the normative arguments that have been made for maximal legal permissibility for assisted reproduction are twofold. One, John Robertson, very famous legal theorist, passed away recently from the University of Texas, said that the choice to pursue or avoid procreation should be free. There's an essential, fundamental right to procreate by means of assisted reproductive technologies because procreation is essential to self-definition and essential to the pursuit of desires and self-expression. What does that sound like? That sounds like expressive individualism, right? It's a clearly expressive individualistic normative foundation for his legal argument, which has effectively prevailed because the main legal landscape for assisted reproductive technologies is the absence of regulation. It's mostly unregulated. We have a federal statute, which is a consumer protection law, the Fertility Clinic Success Rate and Certification Act of 1992, which requires clinics to report their success rates, but there's no enforcement mechanism. There's a paltry audit mechanism. It really is a paper tiger. It doesn't really mean anything. It's not enforced, and there are routine violations by very prominent members of the ART community, and it just doesn't matter. But notice it's framed as a consumer protection law, right? What is the purpose of that law? The purpose of that law is to inform consumers about what they can expect from a service provider, right? They don't publish instances of illness or injury to the babies. They don't publish instances of adverse health outcomes for mothers. It's just success rates, okay? And again, what you can see in this law, as weak as it is, it's still framed as a transaction between a customer and a provider of a service. There's no consideration at all in the law for the child who will be born. I'm not talking yet about unborn children. I'm talking about a child who everybody wants to be born. And they're pulling out all the stops to make a baby who will be born, whoever the baby happens to be, the one that meets all the tests and sex selection and everything else. At the end of this process, everybody hopes there'll be a baby. But there's no consideration or legal requirement to act in that baby's health interests. In fact, there is evidence, even though the overall numbers are low, of a doubling of the instance of birth defects in children conceived by IVF, certain kinds of birth defects. And even more commonly than that, the instance of multiple gestations, where you have 3 and 4 babies at a time, because multiple embryos are transferred per cycle to increase the success rate, so you can publish your success rate in the Consumer Protection Report, is highly associated with adverse outcomes, prematurity, respiratory problems, and all the bad health outcomes that come with prematurity. And so-called selective reduction, which is selective abortion, to reduce the number of babies in utero turns out not to prevent this prematurity. All it does is prevent the existence of more babies after the birth takes place. On the judicial side, Davis versus Davis, a seminal case from the Supreme Court of Tennessee, was a dispute about the disposition of frozen embryos between a husband and a wife who were getting a divorce. And the court said, after weighing the different competing interests, again, interests, individual competing adversarial interest, expressive individualism is the overlay here, they decided that the individual's right not to procreate should prevail. And so the embryos were destroyed. They were in cryostorage. There were probably about 800,000 embryos in cryostorage in the United States. There were 400,000 in 2003. And some states that have law in this area simply codify the professional guidelines of the industry standards, which are safety, efficacy, and privacy. Again, all goods that relate to individual interests. Safety for the patients involved, not for the baby to be born. So the anthropological foundations of the law and policy in this area is that persons are conceived as individuals pursuing an identity-defining plan. The goods at stake are framed in terms of individualism, privacy, choice, including sex selection, rational mastery, imposing technology on the process. Now compare that with what my old boss Leon Cass said, how he described what a baby is. A baby is a mysterious stranger that you welcome and love unconditionally. And that's part of what it means to be a parent. And that also tracks what Sandel and May and others talk about, the openness to the unbidden. There's something about Gil Mylander, another bioethicist, says it's important that a child is begotten and not made. It's important that a child is not the object of your will that you create, because how could you ever stand in a relationship of equality and equal dignity, which all people share, or should share, in my judgment at least, equal dignity to somebody that you made, right? So there's something about procreation, there's something kind of beautiful about the randomness of procreation in the normal state of affairs that is moved, and you move further and further away from that, the more rational mastery you impose on the process. The more it looks like quality assurance and manufacture, and the less it looks like simply a medical intervention to help people conceive who can't conceive, right? And the concept of bargain for exchange and commerce is a category that's imposed on this area, as I've just discussed. What's missing? The body is missing. We've become forgetful of the body, as Alistair McIntyre said, because Jerry Shatton, a very famous biologist, was at the University of Pittsburgh, not sure where he is now. We invited him to the President's Council on Bioethics. We asked him 6 weeks in advance to tell us in a sentence or two what he thinks the most important purpose of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is. That is, genetic analysis of embryos that are in IVF before they're transferred to the mother's uterus. 6 weeks to think about it, and here's what he said. He said, genetic screening of IVF embryos is the way that parents can achieve their dream of a disease-free legacy. That's what he said. The word missing from that sentence is child, or baby, or offspring, or family. The word parent implies a child, right, I think. But it really is about self-definition, self-expression. It tracks John Robertson. And again, none of this is to say, by the way, that people who use IVF or ART are thinking about their families in this way. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the structure of the law, the details of the law are such that these are the categories the law uses. These are the categories the law looks to the extent the law does anything at all in the context of assisted reproduction. And the default is no law. And that itself, creating a freewheeling space of private ordering, is itself an arrangement that's suited to expressive individualism. All right. What time is it, Robert? How long have we been going? 60 minutes? Are you kidding me? Gosh, it seems so fast up here. All right. So I was going to talk about abortion. I was also going to talk about embryos. We're not going to talk about those things. I'm going to wrap it up. Okay? Here's the deal, though. An important thing that I haven't mentioned that we can connect to the ART context is the idea that and this was your question, right? What is a human being? When does human life begin? The answer depends on what your idea of what a person is and what constitutes human flourishing, right? If your view of human identity takes its bearings from the natural facts that the life of a living organism who develops in continuity across gestational stages begins at conception, and that the fact of a living human organism, the same human organism, as I said, everybody in this room was nobody in this room was an egg or a sperm, everyone in this room was an embryo, everyone in this room was a fetus, everyone in this room was a newborn, everyone in this room was an adolescent and will be, hope God willing, an elderly person before you go to your reward. If you take seriously reciprocal dependence, if you take seriously the idea that it's unjust for some members of the community to draw the borders of the moral and legal community in a way that excludes others based on criteria that they establish, that is, you set a line that says if you don't have presently active cognition, if you can't come up with a future-directed plan because your brain's not sufficiently developed yet, or maybe it was but it isn't anymore, or maybe it won't ever be because you're disabled, if you think that that individual is not a person who doesn't enjoy the protection of the law, then you, I think, are embracing a kind of notion of expressive individualism. If you, on the other hand, regard fundamental human equality should be extended to all living human members of the species, and that it's unjust for some people to draw the lines that exclude others and put others in based on their own interests, and you think that it's a self-defeating and self-destroying conception of equality to have a regime in which winners and losers in the personhood context are chosen by the strong for their benefit, then you might very well say that we should craft laws that protect, or at least extend basic legal protections to human beings at the margins, at the very beginning of their lives, at the very end of their lives, and so on. The normative arguments for abortion are personhood arguments, saying not every human being is a person, because you have to meet a certain standard that we establish, things we think are important about being a human being, cognition, and so on. If you fall below that standard, then you're not a person. That's one pro-choice argument. The pro-life rejoinder to that is, no, that's kind of radically exclusionary and discriminatory, because what you're doing is picking winners and losers in the most essential and vital conflict based on your interests as to what's important about human flourishing, or the other argument for abortion rights relate to the burdens that an unborn child uniquely impose on her mother. You say, well, burdensomeness then excludes you from the circle of personhood. The pro-life rejoinder to that is no. The right answer is you have two individuals who are relational in the most intimate way that we can encounter in human experience, and the right answer is to extend protection, love, solidarity to both of them, and the one thing that is off the table is the notion of intentionally killing one of the two of them for the benefit of the other, right? That's a very quick way of responding to your question. But my ultimate argument here, and again circling back to the very beginning, is that in the context of abortion, in the context of embryo research, in the context of assisted reproductive technologies, in the context of end-of-life decision-making, to have a truly human public bioethics, we can't simply focus on freedom and privacy, as important as those things are, in our own plans and our own transactions and our own future-directed projects, but we also have to think about persons as embodied, relational, vulnerable, dependent, and finite, and embrace the goods of solidarity and community, of unchosen obligations based on reciprocal indebtedness, radical hospitality, accompaniment and suffering, compassion, humility, tolerance of imperfection, openness to the unbidden, gratitude, just generosity, and friendship. So thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. I look forward to your questions and conversation. I honestly would have said we're about 35 minutes in. It's just totally... I'm happy to take, again, you guys, I understand. If you have to leave, please, I will not be insulted because it's late and it's rainy and it's a weeknight. But if you want to talk, have some questions. Yes?
First of all, thank you for coming. I love your talk a lot. You mentioned a lot of things that I don't know about representing one thing. I'm a big fan of your idea of recognizing the virtue of our shared vulnerability as being a national person condition. and our dependentness on one another in order to live flourishing lives. But I'm wondering what sort of justification that you can give, especially if you focus on embodiment, about if and what kind of moral duties that you believe we have to future generations, those that aren't embodied. Because it seems as if, especially in the wake of imminent climate disaster.
Yeah. So that's a great question, and I think that our reciprocal indebtedness runs. Oh, let me repeat the question. I'll summarize So your question is, the questioner appreciates the notion of reciprocal indebtedness and vulnerability. What about obligations to future generations who don't exist yet, given the concerns about embodiment, right? So the future generations will be embodied, right? Future generations will have bodies, will exist as bodies, will need an atmosphere and an appropriate temperature and food and land and everything else that I think imposes on us an obligation of stewardship, right? So I believe that the very core of reciprocal indebtedness and vulnerability and just generosity applies to people in the future, and just as gratitude to people in the past that are dead and don't have bodies anymore, presumably, right? We have gratitude for those people, and we're indebted to future generations as well. We're connected to them as well, and that imposes a serious obligation on our own consumption and our own behavior with respect to the natural world and the environment. Yep. Yes.
I have two questions. First question is diet. So we were talking about abortion and the idea of the load on the mother. I thought about a specific case of rape. So I feel like, I don't know, maybe the biology or the society or the law is set up in a way to be able to more blackmail the mother than the raper. Like, it's a human being, don't get rid of it, shame for you.
Right.
And there are so many ways for the raper to step away.
Right. No, that's right. Yeah. I mean, so the question of rape is one of the most, there are human circumstances where we have sort of tragic situations, right? There are situations where an injury has been done to someone, genocide has occurred, right? So here, let me back up. My view of the situation that's presented in the case that you're talking about is a situation where you have an unbelievable, maybe the worst violation of another human being that you could imagine, right? The idea of violating a woman in that way is just, it's impossible to, especially as a man, it's impossible to imagine, right? Impossible to imagine, right? That is a hugely salient and important fact in our thinking about this. And we have to take that seriously, and we have to do everything we possibly can to provide justice and to provide comfort and to provide misericordia, that is accompaniment in the suffering of another person. And that includes not just private action, but that requires public action. Not just for victims of rape, but for every woman who is facing a pregnancy, an unexpected pregnancy, an unwanted pregnancy. There has to be a thick network of public and private aid to provide that woman with the best possible future that she can have, right? But if you focus on what an abortion is the intentional killing of a developing human life. Now, people disagree about whether or not that life has meaning or not, but it's inarguable that it's a living member of the human species, right? So the question is, can you intentionally kill an innocent individual human organism if you ascribe moral value to that organism, which I think, I haven't heard a good argument as to why you shouldn't, right, other than arguments that are basically just about power, right? Power is like, it's more beneficial that this category of human beings be excluded from the circle of humanity, right, and the protection of the law. I think the question becomes, is it a just response to the grave injustice to eliminate an innocent individual? Because you could say, in some ways, you could say the same thing. It's not as relational. You could say the same thing about a newborn child who was the product of rape. That child's existence is a continuing affront and embodiment of the grave and unspeakable violation of that woman. And it would help that person for that child to be killed, right? So to be wiped, to be eliminated as a memory of the terrible violation that occurred. I can't think of an argument that's just or fair, taking seriously the rights and entitlements and the considerations of justice connected to that unborn child that would license the intentional killing of that child. I can't think of any arguments as horrific as that burden is, but it does impose an extraordinary obligation on everyone to do justice, to accompany that woman in her suffering, to be compassionate, to provide for her needs, and the like. What's your next question?
So my next question, I don't mean to turn into a political question.
That's okay. Law and politics are deeply entwined, so it's perfectly fine.
When you are saying repeatedly that the main purpose of law is to see what's best, what's good, so I was thinking that laws are made by Congress. And what are Congress members, or how close are Congress members to this conscience?
Right. So it's a hard, yeah. So you put your finger on a deep political theory problem. What's the best form of government? Democracy is the worst except for all others, right? Is what someone said once. Winston Churchill maybe said that. It's an intractable problem, right? And what I said, by the way, was that all law aims at a good. All law is intended for a particular purpose. Some of those purposes are highly controversial, right? How do you get back to the environmental question? How do you balance commerce and economic growth with environmental degradation, right? People have different answers to that question. But we have to have a policy. We have to have a law. We can't let, it's not anarchy. We can't let, unless you have an anarchic form of government with the absence of government, right? Our government, we have to settle these questions, and we do it through deliberation and conversation and voting. And there are different forms of voting. There's voting, there's consensus, there are different models of governmental decision-making. But you're putting your finger on a very deep problem, which is to say, who's to say that the results of these legislative processes are in fact just or good? Or there have been moments in recent American history where the law has been unjust, bad, right? What do you do about that? Well, the processes that we have to fix that problem are to change the law, or to resist the law, or to overthrow the government. Right? Those are the options. Yes?
So it seems that throughout your talk, you focus a lot on the origin of human life, and that's kind of very much defined in what a human is. So fertilized embryo. In recent times, it becomes increasingly easy to imagine a future where human life doesn't simply come about. Like something that looks like human life doesn't just come out and biologically.
Absolutely. Right. Artificial intelligence, yeah. Genetic engineering. Yeah, it's a great question. So it's easy, I think, it's not easy, it's hard and contested, but it is easier to talk about naturally occurring things and to have categories that make sense for naturally. But as you say, what about the idea of you can use genome editing to create organisms that have never existed in certainly on this planet before. What is that? Does it have consciousness? How do you know what that is? So I would say, first of all, and I borrow this from environmental law, there's a notion of a precautionary principle, right? That if you don't know, if you have a doubt about what something is, or about about the consequences of a very significant act you're about to take, you should maybe pump the brakes a little bit. And you should say, let's not do this thing that might wipe out, entire food crops in Asia, right? A gene drive, gene editing experiment, right? Let's not do that, because even though there might be some benefit, and again, then the question becomes, we have a conversation about this, we resolve it, and this gets to your question about government. There was an interesting debate, and this is a totally different context, in Switzerland, I think, about a super collider they wanted to build, and where they would slam, atomic particles against each other and learn really interesting things about quantum theory and so on. But there was a small, some might say zero, but not zero, chance that it could create a black hole that would swallow the whole Earth. So the question becomes who gets to decide whether those experiments are okay, right? You could imagine people saying, I don't care how interesting those results are, If it's a point, oh, Googleplex 1% of destroying this part of the universe, let's not do that. But then you have a scientist saying, you don't understand. The statistical unlikelihood of this is basically the same thing as zero. Is it zero? Well, no, it's not zero, right? So the question becomes, how do you sort that out, right? But your question is exactly right, and the temptation. And I've been in rooms with scientists, who are making things that are new, and they've said, well, it's sentient, the thing I made, in the sense that it can experience neurological phenomena. It can feel things. I don't know if it has a neural net to conceptualize or to self-awareness. I don't know about that. What am I supposed to do? and the response is, well, let's pump the brakes a little bit and have a conversation before you start making that stuff. If an alien lands and it starts talking to you, you can say, okay, you reason by analogy. This seems like a thing that is similar to a human being. I mean, we owe this an obligation of equal treatment and not abuse it or enslave it or whatever. Treat that as we would want to be treated if we showed up on some other planet and so on. It's a very difficult question. And what I would say, I suppose, is if you're having a preceding conversation before people start making stuff about what's important, what's important and special about human beings or any organism, to think as capaciously as we can about what our lived experience is, right? And to try to cultivate our moral imagination to see others who don't seem like us, but that we still have connections to and obligations of care to. There are people who are severely disabled. There are people who live very far away from us, who I can't see, and when I think about them, I can get worried about them. If there's a famine in Africa, if there's a war in Asia, I'm a parent, I know what must those kids and their parents feel like. I can access that, if I practice my moral imagination. And we have to do that, I think, generally to understand our unchosen obligations to others.
Well, maybe people like to speak to after, that's great.
Yeah, come on up if you want. Thank you all again so much. I appreciate your patience.